Imagine being born into a world where your marriage, your children, even your body aren't yours to control. A world where love is irrelevant and your bloodline is your destiny. For centuries, royal families clung to power by locking themselves into a dangerous game in breeding. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. Brothers wed their own sisters, all in the name of preserving pure blood and unchallenged rule. But behind the silk curtains and golden crowns was a much darker truth-twisted family trees, tragic children and minds shattered by inherited madness. This isn't just a story about royal scandal. It's about what happens when generations are built on isolation and obsession. The consequences weren't just physical, they were psychological, political, and deeply human. In this journey, you'll step into the lives of history's most inbred women queens, mothers, daughters, each trapped in a web spun long before they were born. From ancient Egypt to modern Australia, their stories span continents and centuries, but all lead to the same haunting question. What is the true cost of keeping power in the family? Imagine being born into a world where your future isn't yours, where love doesn't matter, where your husband is your cousin, or worse, your uncle. Not because of romance, but because keeping royal blood pure mattered more than anything else. This was the tragic gamble royal families made for centuries, marrying within their own ranks to preserve power. But the cost twisted genetics, mental breakdowns, deformed children, and secrets so dark they were buried with their bearers. Today, you'll walk through the tragic stories of history's most inbred women, some queens, some modern, all trapped in lives they never truly chose. Let's begin with number 10. 10. Isabella II of Spain. A queen. Built on a broken tree. Born in 1830 and reigning from 1833 to 1868, Isabella II of Spain was a product of a royal family obsessed with keeping their power intact, her parents' uncle and niece. And if that isn't tangled enough, her grandparents were also her great-grandparents. Let that sink in. As a young girl, Isabella's health was already fragile. Whispers floated about her odd mannerisms and sickly constitution. She was only 16 when she was forced to marry her double-second cousin, a man who, according to many historians, was likely homosexual. Their marriage cold, complex, and painfully political. She endured 11 pregnancies, but only 5 children survived infancy. And here's the twist. It's widely believed that not a single one of those children were fathered by her husband. In the end, she lost not only her power, but the throne entirely, her entire reign collapsing under the very weight of her inbred inheritance. 9. Marie Louise of Austria. Married to her father's enemy. Now let's rewind a few decades to another royal Marie Louise of Austria. Born to double first cousins, her genetic makeup was already compromised from birth. In fact, her parents shared so much DNA that Marie Louise had only 4 unique great-grandparents instead of the typical 8. She was the eldest of 12 children and only 7 of them survived. That gives you an idea of the price this family paid to maintain their genetic purity. At just 18 years old, Marie Louise was married off to Napoleon Bonaparte, the very man her father had spent his life fighting. Her marriage was a political chess move meant to bring peace and produce an heir, but behind the ceremony and diplomacy was a teenager shouldering a legacy of genetic fragility and dynastic pressure. 8. Lorraine Whittaker. Inbreeding in the modern age. Inbreeding isn't just a relic of medieval Europe. Enter Lorraine Whittaker, part of the infamous Whittaker family from rural West Virginia, brought into the spotlight by a haunting video documentary. This isn't royalty. This is generational isolation. The Whittakers lived in a closed-off community where cousins married cousins over and over again. And Lorraine, she's considered one of the most genetically inbred individuals ever recorded. She's also the mother of Tiny Whittaker, who's often referenced as possibly the most inbred person alive today. These aren't just tragic tales of the past. They're modern-day echoes of what happens when genetics are pushed too far for too long. 7. Maria I of Portugal madness. Passed through the blood, back to royalty. Maria I of Portugal, born in 1734, was known to her people as Maria the Pious. But behind the prayers was a woman crumbling under genetic pressure. Her parents, King Joseph the Fain of Portugal and Maria Anna Victoria of Spain, were yet another royal couple united by blood. In fact, they were the 16th such incestuous match between the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. The result, Maria's mental health began deteriorating shortly after she gave birth. Desperate to preserve her family's name, Maria took the unimaginable step of marrying her own uncle at 25. The children she had with him, many died young victims, doctors believe, of the genetic fragility bred into them. And Maria herself descended into madness, eventually unable to rule, imprisoned in her own mind. 6. Marie Louise Elizabeth d'Orléans, a Gothic tale of alcohol and grief. If Gothic novels had royalty, Marie Louise Elizabeth would be their queen. Her story is steeped in grief addiction and genetic chains. Born from a miserable marriage between Philip II, Duke of Orléans, and his illegitimate cousin, a daughter of Louis XIV, she was born into a family where love was a far second to bloodline strategy. Forced to marry her cousin Prince Charles of Berry, her life spiraled from one tragedy to the next. She gave birth to 3 children, none of whom survived. The loss crushed her, and by the age of 14 she had already turned to alcohol. Her dependence only grew, and some historians believe it was both a symptom of trauma and a contributing factor to her continued grief and decline. Whether it was the overlapping bloodlines or the immense emotional strain, Marie Louise's story is one of a woman broken by a system she couldn't escape. 5. Princess Alexia of Greece, a modern royal knot. Born in 1965. Princess Alexia of Greece might not seem like a tragic figure at first glance, but take a closer look at her family tree, and you'll see the pattern repeating just in a more modern disguise. Her parents, Queen Anne Marie of Denmark and King Constantine II of Greece, were second cousins and third cousins, twice over. Constantine's ancestry reads like a web great-grandparents who were siblings, a grandmother who was the sister of his great-grandfather. Anne-Marie's lineage is just as tangled. It's the last gasp of a royal tradition desperately clinging to itself. And while Alexia and her siblings seem outwardly healthy, they carry within them the echo of dynasties that valued lineage over life itself. 4. Maria Antonia of Austria, the forgotten Habsburg, with the worst genes. You've probably heard of Charles II of Spain, the Habsburg king, so inbred he could barely chew his food or walk properly. But what if I told you someone in his own family was even more genetically damaged? Meet Maria Antonia of Austria. While Charles II is often cited as the poster child for royal inbreeding, Maria Antonia actually surpassed him in one crucial area, her inbreeding coefficient. This is a genetic measurement that shows how closely related your parents are. Maria Antonia's score was higher than that of a child born to 2 full siblings. Her family tree. It wasn't a tree, it was more like a tightly wound vine wrapped around itself. With repeated uncle-niece, cousin-cousin, and even double-cousin marriages in her lineage, Maria Antonia didn't stand a chance. Yet her story remains overshadowed by more famous relatives, quietly marking one of the most extreme examples of inherited biological collapse in royal history. 3. The Tragedy of Mummies, 317a and 317b, Ancient Egypt's Dark Secret. You find yourself in the heart of ancient Egypt, 1300 BC. Gold glitters temple's tower, and the name Tutankhamun reigns over the land. But behind that splendor is a sorrowful secret, the tiny mummified bodies of 2 infant girls, Mummy 317A and 317B. These children were daughters of Pharaoh Tutankhamun and his wife Ankhesenamun. But this wasn't a typical royal match. Ankhesenamun wasn't just his queen, she was his half-sister. Their father Akhenaten had passed on not only the throne, but also a pattern of sibling marriage that had plagued Egyptian royalty for generations. When these two girls were found, their bodies told a silent but heartbreaking tale. One was stillborn. The other died just months after birth. Modern genetic studies show they bore the heavy toll of inbreeding, likely carrying debilitating mutations from their closely related parents. In their tiny frames, you see the collapse of a dynasty that had pushed its bloodline to the brink. 2. Kimberly Colt, the face of a modern horror. If you think stories like these belong to the past, think again. In rural Australia, a scandal exploded in the early 2000s that left the world stunned. It was the story of the Colt family, an alias given by authorities to protect identities. For generations, this family lived in remote, isolated communities engaging in repeated acts of incest and abuse. The result, dozens of children born with profound disabilities and deformities. At the center of this chilling saga is a woman known only by the pseudonym Kimberly Colt. She is considered by some accounts the most inbred living person ever recorded. Authorities discovered over a dozen children with severe cognitive and physical impairments, all born from a labyrinth of overlapping and illegal family relationships. Kimberly wasn't a queen, she wasn't a princess. But her story is perhaps the most terrifying of all because it happened not behind palace gates but in plain sight. She stands as a stark reminder that inbreeding isn't just a royal relic. In some corners of the world, its legacy is ongoing, devastating, and very real. 1. Cleopatra 2. A throne built on sibling blood. You've heard of Cleopatra, the glamorous queen of Egypt, lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But long before that, Cleopatra centuries earlier, there was Cleopatra 2. And her story is far more disturbing. She was a Ptolemy, part of the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies had a simple rule: never let the throne leave the family. To enforce that, they married their brothers and sisters, again and again and again. Cleopatra was born to a sibling couple, her grandparents also siblings, and her children the product of more sibling marriages. She even married her own brother twice. This wasn't a one-time mistake, it was strategy, a royal philosophy. The Ptolemies believed divine blood must remain untainted. But the consequences were catastrophic. By Cleopatra II's generation, madness, deformity, and early death haunted the royal family. Yet power always won out over biology. One by one, her children died. Some were murdered, some went insane. And through it all, Cleopatra II tried to hold her crumbling dynasty together, ruling beside men who were quite literally her mirror image in blood. In the end, her story, like all the others you've heard, isn't just about royal scandal or genetic horror. It's about what happens when the desire to hold on becomes more important than the wisdom to let go. From golden palaces to rural shacks, these stories all echo the same truth: the pursuit of purity, whether for power, pride, or tradition, can leave behind a trail of tragedy. And while the world has moved forward, these tales remind us how dangerous it is to lock ourselves away from others, even in the name of legacy. You've now walked through the dark hallways of history's most inbred women, trapped in thrones, marriages, and lineages they didn't choose. But what happened after the palace lights dimmed? What became of their children, their nations, and their names? The legacy of inbreeding didn't end with them, it echoed across generations, and in some cases it still echoes today. Let's step into the long shadows they left behind. A legacy of loss, the children left behind. Picture yourself as the child of a queen. Gold plates, silken robes. But your body doesn't function right. Your mind feels clouded. You're not like the others. Many of the women in our story brought life into the world only to watch it flicker and fade far too soon. Isabella II of Spain gave birth to 11 children. Just 5 survived. And even then, whispers surrounded their legitimacy and health. Maria I of Portugal's children suffered from seizures, developmental disorders, and emotional instability. One of them was declared unfit to rule before reaching maturity. Marie-Louise Elizabeth d'Orléans lost all her children in infancy. The royal doctors called it bad luck. But you now know better. It was a cruel inheritance passed from cousin to cousin, sealed with a crown. Even Cleopatra, too, who ruled with sheer will, witnessed her family tear itself apart. Her son rebelled and waged war against her. Others were poisoned or executed. Her family, once seen as divine, collapsed under its own genetic weight. The science of royal madness. Modern geneticists have studied these dynasties with a mix of fascination and horror. Inbreeding, especially over multiple generations, can concentrate harmful recessive genes. It increases the risk of physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, infertility, and early death. Think of a family tree like a web. The more tightly you pull the threads inward, the more tension builds, and eventually, it breaks. The Habsburg jaw, a famously disfigured lower face seen across generations, wasn't just cosmetic. It made chewing difficult, speaking hard, breathing sometimes painful, and it wasn't isolated. Alongside it came epilepsy, sterility, and mental illness. Charles II of Spain. Maria Antonia's cousin was so disabled he could barely walk unaided. He couldn't produce an heir, and his death without a child sparked the War of Spanish Succession, plunging Europe into chaos. All because his ancestors refused to look outside their own blood. Escaping the cycle, the royals who said no. But not all royal families stayed on the path. Some eventually realized the cost was too high. After centuries of tight inbreeding, the British royal family began reaching outward. Queen Victoria's children married into families across Europe, not always for love, but with an eye on health. Ironically, they still spread one dangerous gene, hemophilia. Victoria was a carrier, and her descendants unknowingly passed it on to royal families in Russia, Germany, and Spain. Tsar Nicholas II's son, Alexei, was one of its most famous victims, bleeding uncontrollably from the slightest injury. Yet in the 20th century, change accelerated. Royals began marrying commoners, sometimes even for love. Health, not heritage, became the priority. In modern monarchies, you now see fresh, diverse bloodlines, new chapters not bound by old rules. Modern echoes, science, stigma, and survival. The Colt family in Australia forced the world to confront a different kind of generational inbreeding. This wasn't about power, it was about isolation, poverty, abuse, and silence. Authorities, social workers, and geneticists had to develop entirely new frameworks to understand how many generations of interbreeding had taken place. DNA tests showed incredibly high inbreeding coefficients levels, similar to those seen in sibling pairings repeated for decades. Children were found with fused toes, severe intellectual delays, and speech disabilities, and the psychological impact even harder to measure. Lorraine Whitaker's family, too, became a lens through which society could no longer look away. Journalists and researchers uncovered how systemic neglect, lack of education, and rural isolation allowed such cycles to persist. But these were no villains, just victims of a system that never reached them. Inherited trauma. More than just DNA. Recent studies in genetics and psychology suggest trauma, especially chronic generational trauma, can be passed down through something called epigenetics. It doesn't change your DNA, but it affects how your genes express themselves. So what does that mean? If a woman lived her entire life in fear, stress, and repression, those signals might shape the body and mind of her child. If a family line endured centuries of loss, isolation, and forced union, the emotional residue may linger. In anxiety, depression, or behavioral patterns, it's not just the bloodline that carries history, it's the very code within us. Why these stories matter today. You might wonder why dig into these dark stories, why revisit pain and deformity and madness, because understanding them helps us see how far we've come and where danger still hides. In isolated communities, in ideologies that prize purity over humanity, in the pressure to preserve legacy at any cost. These women, Isabella, Maria, Lorraine, Cleopatra, weren't monsters. They were mothers, daughters, pawns, survivors, and sometimes unwilling queens. They lived in systems built on obsession with control image and blood, systems that saw them not as people, but as vessels. And yet, despite everything, they endured. Some ruled, some raised children, some carved out fragments of joy in lives shaped by chains they never chose. Your turn to speak. If their stories moved you, confused you, or shook, you don't let them vanish into silence. Speak up. Talk about them. Share what shocked you the most. Comment with your thoughts. Because it's in the telling of their truths that we keep history honest and maybe even protect the future. And if you want to dive deeper into the hidden corners of royal bloodlines, forbidden marriages, or the science of inherited trauma, hit that subscribe button. History doesn't just live in books, it lives in us.